Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So ever since Donald Trump left office and was banned from Twitter and various other social media, there's been a discussion surrounding social media censorship, whether it's justified in some cases, whether it shouldn't be happening at all, and I thought I would share my views on this issue using the first installment of Argument Review. So for those of you who haven't yet seen my intro video, Argument Review is a series I'm going to be doing where I take a bunch of talking points from both the left and right about a particular issue and I review them. I share how strong I think the argument is, point out any possible logical fallacies that it's committing, and give my thoughts on that particular argument. Now, I think it's fairly obvious that this segment is inspired by PewDiePie's meme review, where he goes on Reddit and looks at memes and reviews them. Of course, this is in a political context, but that's where the inspiration comes from. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first argument I have here is the private company or the free market argument. And basically that's when someone says, well, Twitter, Facebook, all of these companies are private companies operating within the free market, and therefore they can block any political viewpoints that they want to. Basically, it's their right. They can do it because they're a private company. Now, the first thing I notice when I hear this argument is the obvious hypocrisy in the person who's usually making the argument. Usually this argument would come from somebody on the left who's sort of justifying the censorship of Donald Trump or any other conservative figure for that matter. And generally, I mean, that's what being left-wing means. These people don't necessarily support a free market system, and yet they're advocating for it in this particular case because it works with their political agenda. But this is a show about the arguments themselves, addressing the content and not who or where they're coming from. So let's just entertain the argument and explore it for a second before we write it off just because of the hypocrisy of the person that's putting it forward. So first of all, I think it's important to establish that the US does not operate under a completely free market economy. There are several regulations on companies, what they can do, what they can't do. Now, as to whether there are specific regulations stopping companies like Facebook and Twitter censoring certain political views, there don't seem to be any. I've done some research on this and I can't really find anything specific. Now, some people might say, okay, the First Amendment protects citizens from sharing their views freely on these platforms. But even that is not completely true because the First Amendment specifically only prevents the government from censoring political speech, and these private entities are not members of the government. So this censorship is legal. But does that mean that it is right? So from a legal perspective, it may be okay to do, but is it the right thing to do? And that's something I'm going to address later on, but I definitely don't think it is the right thing to do, especially if you're trying to operate under a free society, as these people are claiming that they want to be operating under. You know, it's important for people's rights to be maintained no matter who they're being infringed upon by. So if you consider free speech to be a right, it doesn't matter who's infringing upon it, whether it is somebody, a private citizen, a private company, or the government. So overall, because this argument holds true in the sense that legally these companies can censor political speech, I think it has some weight in that sense. But since if it's ever brought up in the context of whether censorship is right or not, it's a very weak argument. But overall, I'll give this argument a 6 out of 10. Let's move on. Another argument, or rather just a claim, and a rather extreme claim that is usually made by right-wingers when they're talking about how frustrated they are with this censorship, is basically comparing the current situation in the United States to 1984 or other dystopian situations in literature or in history. So I totally understand that people are making exaggerations for effect and they're warning against what could potentially happen. And I definitely agree that doing this kind of censorship does set a dangerous precedent, especially in a digital world where these companies control so much and they control the spread of information. Basically, they have a monopoly on the spread of information. So yes, I agree that this is dangerous, but making extreme sort of claims like this, which aren't true by any sense of the claim that you make, just turns people off. It makes people think, okay, this is a lunatic who doesn't know what he's talking about, so I'm not going to listen to him. And, that's all she wrote. That's all that happens. So I don't think this argument is productive at all, even though it might have some important messages about the potential dangers of this kind of censorship in the future. So because it has some kind of truth to it in the sense that it does warn against the dangers, I'm going to give it some credit. But because it turns people off immediately and isn't completely accurate, I'm going to give this argument a 2 out of 10. Okay, the next argument I have written here is the hate speech argument. So basically when people say that this sort of censorship is justified because it's preventing hate speech, which can hurt people, so on and so forth. Now, first of all, I have to give credit to the people who make this argument in the sense that they're not attaching themselves to a position that they don't consistently support, like the people who talk about free market capitalism. They are saying that they agree with certain regulations in terms of what speech can be said or not. Now, whether that is a good thing, I definitely don't think so, but at least they're more honest and upfront about their views. But once again, this is a show about the argument itself and not the people who are putting it forward. So let's explore this argument. So this is actually the primary reason why social media giants use to justify censorship. And this is why a lot of people would generally advocate for governmental censorship, because some speech is quote unquote dangerous. So you may argue that some speech needs to be censored. I mean, I personally believe that all speech, no matter how ridiculous, should be allowed, because I think that sunlight is the best disinfectant. If there are ridiculous ideas, the best way to sort of toss them aside and make sure that they don't spread dangerously is by actually combating them, challenging them, letting people think for themselves and realize, this is not a good argument, instead of sort of hiding them, which can sort of get people enticed and looking into those arguments even if they wouldn't originally agree with them or have that kind of line of thought. So I definitely think that any kind of speech, no matter how ridiculous it is, should be allowed. Now, there definitely is some speech that is censored, and justifiably so. For example, if you threaten someone physically and that threat actually holds weight in reality, that is not allowed and that shouldn't be allowed. I agree. But the problem with having hate speech laws is that, who determines what hate speech is? Some people's feelings are going to be hurt, and I think that is definitely a price to be paid that has to be paid for productive discourse and for a society to actually move forward. But more importantly, if a left-winger is looking at certain speech that they don't like, they can call that hate speech. If a right-winger is looking at it, a left-winger's speech, they can call that hate speech. So it depends entirely on the person who's judging, and that's why it's so dangerous to have these sort of hate speech laws, or to even say that hate speech is a thing. It's Of course, if you define it as harassment, that's a completely different thing. But if you just define it as a dangerous idea, that's very, very subjective. And that's the problem, because it can be easily used by whatever political party is in power at that time to censor views that they don't like, which is moving towards a sort of authoritarian, totalitarian state where there's no civil liberties and people aren't allowed to express their views, which is, I'm sure, certainly what most people don't want to happen. So because this argument is so weak in the sense that hate speech is so subjective and there's no way of really determining what it is, I have to give this argument a 1 out of 10. So this next argument is, I'd say, the strongest argument for explaining why social media censorship is dangerous and why it shouldn't happen. And that is that big tech giants are monopolies, and in a digital age where information is spread largely over the internet, I mean, that's the primary source of where people get their information from, because these companies have a monopoly on that kind of information, this is extremely dangerous. So I think that this argument is very strong, but let's sort of get into it. So conservatives and other political dissenters, because at the moment I'd say that common culture is highly liberal, they've long talked about opening another platform for discussion. But because of how powerful these giants are and how used to we are to these platforms, it just hasn't been realistic to form another company, another platform that people can use largely. And this might be a result of government intervention to an extent, in the sense that certain companies might be supported by the government, which is why other companies don't stand a chance. But it's also a possibility under a free market. I mean, a lot of people criticize free markets for the potential for them to create monopolies. So we have to admit that they do well in satisfying the majority of their customers, and that's why they've become so large and continue to be so large. But the problem here is now they have sole control over information exchange, especially in our digital age. And competitors are completely crushed, and it's just not feasible for large-scale exchange of ideas. And what's even worse is that now these competitors, when they try to open platforms, when they try to promote themselves, they're also being banned by other companies that have a lot of power. So all of this information is being controlled solely by these giants, and no other company stands a chance. And that is very, very problematic, because what's going to happen eventually is that, there's only going to be one set of ideas or one side viewpoint that's being expressed on these platforms, whereas other people can't express their views, any political dissenters, and that's very dangerous to a democratic and a free society, where it's very important for different ideas to be expressed and changes to be made accordingly. That's what I think is the strongest argument for why social media censorship shouldn't happen at all, especially not along the lines of hate speech. So, because of how strong this argument is, I'd say that this is a 9 out of 10, easily. It's a very strong argument. It considers the reality of today and is rigorous. I don't see any glaring flaws or fallacies in this particular argument. So I'm definitely going to be making other videos about my thoughts on this, maybe in sort of a more free-flowing structure where I can just explain all of my ideas and get them out there. But that'll do it for me today. Thank you for watching.